The rain in Black Creek didn't wash things clean. It only churned the dirt into a sucking, venomous mud that swallowed boots and hope in equal measure. Outside the Black Ace's saloon, the storm was a living thing, hammering against the corrugated tin roof with the rhythm of 1,000 nervous fingers tapping on a coffin lid. Inside, the air was thick enough to choke a man, heavy with the stench of wet wool, stale tobacco smoke, and the sour copper tang of desperation. Clara stood near the door, water dripping from the hem of her threadbare dress, forming a dark pool around her broken shoes. She had learned long ago to make herself small, to curl her shoulders inward and lower her chin until she was nothing more than a shadow in the periphery of her husband's vices. Silas was at the center table, as he always was on nights when the devil was riding him, his knuckles white as bone where they gripped his cards. The lantern light swayed overhead, casting long, sickly shadows that danced across his face, a face that had once been handsome before the drink, and the bitterness eroded it like water on sandstone. Clara watched his hands. She knew the tremor in them. It wasn't the cold, it was the losing. Silas was a man who believed the world owed him a fortune, and every time the cards told him otherwise, his debt came due in rage. She could feel the violence radiating off him, a heat more intense than the cast-iron stove in the corner. Tonight, the pot was small, but Silas's eyes were wide and frantic, darting between the pile of chips that wasn't his and the empty glass that was. The game was a slow bleed, and Silas was the one providing the blood. Across from him sat a trio of miners, hard men with faces like crushed gravel, their eyes glinting with the predatory amusement of wolves circling a limping deer. They knew Silas. Everyone in the territory knew Silas. He was the man who shouted loudest about his grand plans while his wife stitched patches onto patches to keep the wind out. One of the miners, a man with a beard like rusted wire, tossed a single chip into the center. The sound was a sharp clack that cut through the murmur of the room. "Raise," the miner grunted, his voice sounding like boots on gravel. Silas stared at the chip. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He had nothing left. His pockets were turned out, white flags of surrender hanging against his trousers. But surrender wasn't in his nature. Only escalation was. He looked around the room, his eyes wild, searching for something, anything to keep the fantasy of the win alive. His gaze landed on Clara. A cold dread, sharper than the winter wind, pierced through her chest. She took a step back, her back hitting the rough timber of the wall, but Silas was already moving. He didn't walk. He lurched, crossing the distance in 3 long strides, his hand shooting out to grab her wrist. His grip was a vice, his fingers digging into her skin with bruising force as he hauled her into the light. The room went quiet. The ambient chatter died, replaced by the heavy, uncomfortable silence of men watching a disaster unfold. "I have collateral," Silas spat, shoving Clara toward the table so hard she stumbled and caught herself on the edge of the wood. The miners looked up, their expressions shifting from amusement to something darker, something uncomfortable. Clara couldn't breathe. The air in her lungs had turned to solid ice. She kept her eyes on the floor, staring at the sawdust and the mud, praying for the floorboards to open up and swallow her whole. "Look at her," Silas demanded, his voice cracking with a hysterical edge. "She's young, strong enough. She can cook, clean, mend whatever you tear." He looked at the miner with the rusted beard, desperation making him bold. "She's mute too. Trauma," the doctor said, "means she don't talk back. A quiet woman is worth double, isn't she?" The cruelty of it hung in the air, naked and ugly. He was listing her features like he was selling a mule at an auction. The miner leaned back, crossing his arms, looking Clara up and down with a slow, insulting appraisal that made her skin crawl. "I came here for money, Silas," the miner said slowly. "Not for a skinny woman with fear in her eyes. She looks like she'd break if a strong wind hit her." Silas slammed his hand on the table, rattling the lantern. "She's tough, and she's mine to trade. I'm putting her against the pot. One hand, winner takes all. If I lose, you take the girl. If I win, I take the gold and the girl stays." Silas looked down at her, his lip curling in a sneer that broke the last of her heart. "She's not worth a penny anyway, but she might just bring me luck." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy enough to crush the breath out of a man. Then, from the darkest corner of the room, a sound emerged. It wasn't a shout or a laugh. It was the slow, rhythmic clink of metal on wood. Clink, clink, clink. A man stood up from the shadows. He had been there the whole time, a spectre in a dust-caked duster, his hat pulled low over his eyes. He walked toward the table with a gait that suggested he owned the ground he stepped on. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried an air of violence that was leashed, but only barely. He stopped at the table, towering over Silas. The miners shifted uneasily, sensing a predator in their midst. The stranger didn't look at the cards. He didn't look at the miners. He looked at Clara. His eyes were the color of steel, cold and unyielding, but for a fleeting second, something flickered in them. Not pity, but recognition. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He upended it over the center of the table. It didn't rain dust. It rained nuggets. Heavy, jagged lumps of raw gold that tumbled onto the wood with a dull, heavy thud that echoed in the greedy hearts of every man in the room. It was more money than Silas had ever seen in his life. It was a fortune. The stranger placed a hand over the gold, his voice a low rumble that vibrated in Clara's chest. "Don't touch that girl again," he ordered, the words soft but edged with a lethal promise. He looked at Silas, his eyes dead and flat. "Sell her to me, right now. I'm buying the contract, and I'm paying in gold." Silas didn't look at his wife. He didn't look at the men who had been mocking him only moments before. His entire world had narrowed down to the pile of gold sitting on the whiskey-stained wood. The nuggets were rough, unrefined, and beautiful in the way that only raw wealth can be to a desperate man. The lamplight caught the jagged edges, sparking a glint of yellow fire that seemed to burn right through Silas's retinas. Greed is a powerful anesthetic. It numbed the shame of selling his own kin and silenced the last whisper of his conscience. He reached out, his hand trembling not with fear now, but with an avaricious hunger, his fingers hovering over the pile as if he expected it to vanish like a mirage. "Done!" Silas croaked, his voice tight and unrecognizable. "She's yours. Take her. Take the trouble she brings too." The stranger didn't blink. He didn't offer a handshake to seal the deal. A man like him didn't touch skin with a man like Silas unless he intended to break it. Instead, he produced a folded piece of parchment and a charcoal pencil from his duster pocket, slapping them onto the table beside the gold. "Sign," he commanded. It wasn't a request. It was an order given by someone used to being obeyed instantly. Silas scribbled his name, the scratch of the charcoal loud in the silent room, effectively signing away a human life for a pouch of rocks. The stranger snatched the paper back, tucking it away near his heart, and then, for the first time, he turned his full attention to Clara. He didn't grab her. He simply nodded toward the door. "Walk," he said. The single word held more weight than all of Silas's screaming. The walk from the table to the door felt like crossing a ravine on a tightrope. Clara could feel the eyes of every man in the room fixed on her back, some filled with pity, others with a dark, leering jealousy that the stranger had walked away with the prize. She kept her head down, her gaze fixed on the stranger's boots. They were heavy, black leather, caked in mud but well cared for, the spurs on the heels dull and lethal. She expected him to grab her arm, to assert his new ownership with a bruise, but he kept a distance of 2 feet between them, a barrier of air that felt colder than the storm outside. As they reached the swinging doors, Silas's voice rang out one last time, shrill and pathetic, trying to reclaim some shred of dignity in a room where he had lost it all. "She's barren, you know. Don't come back asking for a refund when she gives you no sons." The stranger paused, his hand on the door. He didn't turn around. He simply tilted his head, his silhouette framed by the lightning flashing outside. "I didn't buy a broodmare, Silas," he said, his voice cutting through the smoke. "And you didn't sell a wife. You sold your salvation." He pushed the doors open, and the wind howled inward, extinguishing the lanterns near the entrance and plunging the front of the room into darkness. Clara stepped out into the night, the rain hitting her face like a slap, washing away the smell of stale beer but doing nothing to wash away the terror that was rising in her throat like bile. She was no longer Silas's property. She belonged to the shadow now. Outside, the storm was a physical assault. The wind whipped down the canyon, stripping the heat from Clara's body in seconds, soaking her thin dress until it clung to her shivering frame like a second skin. The stranger didn't seem to notice the cold. He moved with efficient purpose toward the hitching rail, where a massive black stallion and a smaller roan pack horse were tethered. The animals were stomping in the mud, their ears pinned back against the thunder. but they settled instantly when the stranger approached. He murmured something low to the stallion, a gentleness in his tone that shocked Clara more than the gold had. He turned to her then, the brim of his hat shielding his eyes, leaving only the hard line of his jaw visible. He saw her shivering, saw the way she hugged her arms to her chest in a futile attempt to hold herself together. Without a word, he unclasped the heavy oilskin duster he wore. He swung it off his shoulders and draped it over hers. The coat was massive, swallowing her whole, heavy and warm and smelling of sage, gun oil and rain. "Mount up," he said, gesturing to the roan. He didn't offer to lift her. He waited to see if she could do it herself. It was a test. Clara's hands shook as she grabbed the saddle horn. She pulled herself up, her muscles screaming, every instinct telling her to run into the dark. But she knew the dark held wolves, and this man held the gun. She settled into the saddle. He checked the cinch, his hand brushing her knee for a fraction of a second. No lingering, no squeeze, just a check. Then he swung onto his stallion, looking not at her, but at the dark, winding trail leading out of town. "Keep up," he said, and they rode into the blackness, leaving the lights of the saloon behind, disappearing into a world where no one could hear her scream. They rode for hours, or perhaps days. Time lost its meaning in the suffocating darkness of the canyon. The only measure of existence was the rhythmic, squelching thud of hooves in mud and the relentless assault of the wind against the oilskin coat Clara wore. It was a shroud of heavy canvas that smelled of a man she didn't know, wrapping her in a warmth that felt dangerously like a trap. Ahead of her, the stranger, Elias, she had heard the whispers, though he had not offered the name himself, was a silhouette cut from the night itself. He didn't look back. Not once. He didn't check to see if she was falling behind, or if she had turned the roan horse around to flee back toward the misery she knew. He rode with the arrogant confidence of a man who knew that the wilderness was a better jailer than any set of iron bars. Clara's mind, however, was a frantic cage of calculated risks. She catalogued every shadow, every twist in the trail, looking for a place to bolt. But where? To the wolves howling in the timber? Back to Silas? The realization settled in her gut like cold lead. She was tethered to this shadow, not by rope, but by the sheer impossibility of survival without him. The rain eventually turned to sleet as the elevation climbed, stinging her face like handfuls of gravel. Her hands, numb and white, gripped the saddle horn until her knuckles ached, the fear of the man ahead battling the freezing cold for dominion over her trembling body. She waited for him to stop. She waited for the moment the transaction would be consummated. Men didn't pay gold for nothing. Silas had taught her that everything had a cost, and women paid theirs in flesh and silence. The trail leveled out into a small clearing sheltered by a jagged overhang of granite, a natural wound in the mountain face that offered respite from the biting wind. Elias pulled his stallion up, the animal snorting steam into the frigid air. Clara stopped the roan a safe distance away, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She watched as he dismounted, his movements stiff from the cold, but fluid with practice. He ignored her, moving instead to the horses, checking their hooves, loosening the cinches, murmuring those same soft, unintelligible words to the beasts. Clara slid from the saddle, her legs buckling as her feet hit the frozen ground. She caught herself on the stirrup, waiting for the reprimand, for the rough hand to steady her. It never came. Elias was already gathering deadwood from beneath the shelter of the overhang. Clara stood frozen, uncertain of her role. In Silas's house, idleness was a sin, punishable by a backhand. Driven by a lifetime of conditioned fear, she scrambled to help, her stiff fingers clawing at wet twigs, trying to prove her worth, trying to show she was useful, as Silas had promised. She brought a small pile to where Elias was crouching. He looked up, the flint and steel in his hand pausing mid-strike. The firelight flared to life in that moment, illuminating the sharp planes of his face, the scar running through his eyebrow, and the utter lack of malice in his eyes. He looked at the twigs in her hand, then at her terrified face. "Sit," he said. It wasn't a bark, it was a weary invitation. He built the fire high, the heat rolling over them in waves that stung Clara's frozen skin. Then he did something that confused her terrified mind into silence. He unstrapped a heavy canvas bedroll from his saddle and set it up near the fire, not for himself, but for her. He laid it out, smoothing the wool blanket, creating a small island of comfort on the hard earth. He took his own bedroll and tossed it near the entrance of the overhang, out in the cold 10 feet away. He sat on his saddlebags, pouring coffee from a battered tin pot, staring into the flames. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Clara sat on the edge of the bedroll, her knees pulled to her chest, watching him. Was he waiting for her to undress? Was this a game? Elias reached into his boot. Clara flinched, her breath hitching, her eyes squeezing shut as she anticipated the violence. She heard the shink of steel leaving leather. "Open your eyes," he said. His voice was low, devoid of the cruelty she expected. Clara obeyed. He was holding a knife, a massive bowie with a handle of staghorn and a blade that gleamed with a wicked razor edge. But he wasn't holding it by the hilt. He was holding the blade, the handle extended toward her. "Take it," he ordered. Clara stared at the weapon, her mind reeling. "Take it," he repeated, sharper this time. "You sleep with it, under your pillow, in your hand. I don't care." She reached out, her hand shaking violently, and took the heavy knife. It felt cold and foreign and powerful. "If I come near you tonight," Elias said, looking her dead in the eye, the firelight dancing in his irises, "and you don't want me to, you put that in my neck, you understand?" He didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back to her, pulled his hat over his eyes, and lay down on the cold ground, leaving her holding the only thing that could kill him. The world changed as they climbed. The sucking mud of the lowlands gave way to the sharp, clean bite of the high country, where the air grew thin and tasted of pine needles and snow. For 3 days, they rode in a silence that was no longer threatening, but companionable, measured only by the creak of saddle leather and the wind sighing through the Douglas firs. Clara rode with the knife tucked into her boot, its steel handle pressing against her ankle, a cold, constant reminder that she possessed the power of refusal, but she hadn't needed it. Elias rode ahead, breaking the wind for her, choosing the safest paths across the shale slides, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, not for game, but for threats. He treated her not as a prisoner, but as a charge, something precious to be guarded, like a sack of gold dust or a loaded rifle. But fear is a muscle memory, etched deep into the bone, and Clara was waiting for the other shoe to drop. It happened on a narrow switchback, where the trail was little more than a scars carved into the granite cliff. The roan mare, tired and sure-footed, stepped on a patch of slick, black ice hidden beneath the shadow of a boulder. The horse stumbled, legs scrambling for purchase. Clara, exhausted and drifting in a daze, was thrown. The ground rushed up to meet her, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs as she slammed into the hard-packed earth. She didn't try to stand. Instinct, honed by years of living with Silas, took over instantly. She curled into a ball, wrapping her arms over her head, tucking her chin to her chest to protect her face. She waited for the shout. She waited for the boot to the ribs, for the accusation of clumsiness, for the rage that always followed an inconvenience. "Stupid cow, look what you did!" The words echoed in her memory, but the air remained silent. Then came the crunch of boots on snow, fast, urgent. She flinched, bracing for the blow. "Easy," a voice rumbled, closer than she expected. "Don't move yet." Hands touched her, not grabbing, but hovering. Elias was kneeling in the snow beside her. He didn't check the horse first, he checked her. His gloved hands ran a quick professional assessment over her arms and legs, checking for breaks. He pulled her hands away from her face gently. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Clara opened her eyes, trembling. Elias's face was inches from hers, his brow furrowed with concern, not anger. "You're all right," he said, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding. "Just a scrape. The mare's fine. You're fine." He helped her sit up, dusting the snow from her shoulder with a touch that was jarringly gentle. It was a violation of everything she knew about men. Violence she could understand. Kindness was a foreign language she couldn't yet translate. That night, the camp was set in a grove of aspen trees, their white bark glowing like ghosts in the moonlight. Elias boiled water in the battered tin pot, then dipped a rag into it. Without asking, he reached for Clara's hand, where the fall had flayed the skin from her palm. He cleaned the wound, the hot water stinging, but Clara didn't pull away. She watched his face in the firelight. He looked tired, The lines around his eyes were deep valleys of old grief. "I had a girl once," Elias said suddenly, his voice rough, breaking the silence he usually guarded so jealously. He didn't look at her. He focused on wrapping a strip of clean linen around her hand. "Sarah. She was about your age, maybe a little younger." He tied the knot, his movements precise. "I was a younger man then. Thought the only thing that mattered was the strike, the gold. I left them alone too often." He paused, and the crackle of the fire seemed to roar in the quiet. "When I came back, the fever had taken her. I had a saddlebag full of dust and a house full of ghosts." He finally looked up, meeting Clara's gaze. "I saw her in you, back at the saloon. The way you looked at the door, like a trapped animal waiting for the hunter." He released her hand. "I didn't buy you to own you, Clara. I bought you because I couldn't save her. Maybe I can save you." The truth of it hit Clara harder than a fist. He wasn't a savior. He was a penitent. He was a man carrying a mountain of regret, trying to pay a debt to a ghost. The fear that had been her constant companion for years began to fracture, hairline cracks appearing in the armor of her silence. She looked at her bandaged hand, then at the man sitting on the other side of the fire, staring into the dark. Her throat felt tight, unused, dusty. She swallowed, fighting the mechanism of mute survival that had kept her safe for so long. She needed to bridge the gap. She needed him to know she heard him. The sound scraped her throat, rusty and small, barely louder than the pop of the firewood. "Thank you." Elias froze. He didn't turn his head, but his shoulders lowered, the tension draining out of him. He stared into the fire for a long moment, then gave a single slow nod. "You're welcome, Clara," he whispered. And for the first time in a decade, the night didn't feel quite so dark. Back in the suffocating gloom of the Black Ace's saloon, time had moved at a different, crueler speed. While Clara and Elias were ascending into the clean air of the high country, Silas was spiraling down into the filth of his own making. The pouch of gold, the fortune that was supposed to buy his freedom, his dignity, and a new life, sat empty on the table, a deflated skin of leather that mocked him in the dim light. It had taken him less than 3 days to lose what a prudent man could have lived on for a decade. The gold had flowed through his fingers like water, dissolved by bad whiskey, worse cards, and the arrogant, drunken belief that his luck had finally turned. It hadn't. The house always wins, and Silas was a man born to lose. He stared at the empty pouch, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with grit, his hands shaking with the tremors of withdrawal and rage. The miner with the rusted beard, the one who had almost bought Clara, sat across from him, stacking Silas's gold into neat, towering pillars. The click-clack of the nuggets hitting one another was a rhythmic torture, a metronome counting down the seconds until Silas was thrown out into the mud again. But as Silas stared at the leather sack, a thought began to take root in his whiskey-soaked brain. It started as a whisper and grew into a roar. The stranger, the man in the duster. He hadn't counted the gold. He hadn't haggled. He had thrown it down as if it were copper pennies. Silas slammed his hand onto the table, causing the towers of gold to wobble. The room went quiet, eyes turning to the desperate man who had already sold his wife and lost the price. "He cheated me," Silas hissed, the spittle flying from his lips. The miner laughed, a harsh, grating sound like a saw-cutting bone. "Cheated you? He paid you a king's ransom for a mute girl and you donated it to the table. You cheated yourself, Silas." Silas stood up, swaying, his face twisting into a mask of ugly realization. "No. Think about it. A man doesn't carry a pouch like that unless he has a source. He didn't care about the gold. It was nothing to him. Which means—" Silas leaned in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that carried across the room. "Which means he has a mine, a stash, a motherlode hidden up there in the peaks." The atmosphere in the saloon shifted instantly. The mockery evaporated, replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of greed. Men who had been ignoring Silas suddenly leaned in. Gold fever is a contagion, more infectious and deadly than smallpox, and Silas had just coughed it into the room. "He went north," Silas continued, seeing he had their attention. "Towards the Whispering Pass. He's heavy with gear, he's moving slow, and he's got my wife slowing him down." The transformation of the room was terrifyingly efficient. The miner with the rusted beard swept the gold into his own pockets and stood up. "If he has a claim," the miner said, his hand drifting to the Colt Navy revolver at his hip, "it belongs to the man who files it, or the man who finds it." Silas nodded, a wicked light entering his eyes. He saw a way to reclaim not just his fortune, but his pride. He would get the gold, and he would punish the man who had looked at him with such disdain. "I know the pass," Silas lied. He didn't know it well, but he knew enough to track a horse in snow. "I can lead you to him, but I want a share, and I want the girl back. She has duties left to fulfill." The miner spat on the floor. "I don't care about the girl. You can strip the meat from the bone for all I care, but the gold is ours." Within an hour, a posse of 6 men had assembled outside. These were not lawmen. They were wolves in human skin, drifters and killers who would shoot a man for his boots, let alone a gold mine. They checked their cinches in the pouring rain, the metallic shuck-shuck of lever-action rifles being loaded echoing in the alleyway. They rode out at a gallop, ignoring the storm. Unlike Elias, who moved with the caution of a protector, these men moved with the reckless hunger of predators. They pushed their horses hard, the animals' flanks foaming with sweat despite the cold. Silas rode in the center, his heart pounding with a toxic mix of fear and anticipation. He imagined the look on the stranger's face when they caught him. He imagined the terror in Clara's eyes when she realized her rescue was over. He didn't just want the money anymore. He wanted to destroy the hope he had seen in the stranger's eyes. The tracks in the mud were deep and easy to follow, the heavy prints of the stallion, the lighter steps of the roan. They were gaining. The mountains loomed ahead, dark and silent, indifferent to the violence that was racing toward them. Up on the high ridges the wind howled, carrying the scent of snow, but down in the valley the air tasted of sulfur and blood. The hunt was on. The mountains had a way of lulling a man into a false sense of security, whispering that the only dangers were the cold and the cliffs, concealing the truth that the most dangerous predators walked on 2 legs. For Elias and Clara, the morning broke with a deceptive, crystal clarity. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and blindingly white under a pale winter sun. They were close now. Elias had relaxed his guard, his posture in the saddle less rigid, his eyes softening as he pointed toward a narrow cleft in the rock formations ahead. "Snake Creek," he told her, his voice carrying through the crisp air. "The valley is just beyond that ridge. It's narrow, but once you're through, it opens up. Nobody comes up here. It's safe." The word hung in the air, a fragile promise made of glass. Clara felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a feeling she hesitantly identified as hope. She watched a hawk circling the thermal currents above, allowing herself to imagine a life where she didn't have to listen for footsteps. The silence of the high country was profound, a vast cathedral of quiet. Then, the cathedral shattered. It didn't sound like a gunshot at first. It sounded like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot, a sharp, cracking pop that echoed strangely off the canyon walls. But the sound was immediately followed by a wet, sickening thud. Elias jerked violently in his saddle as if an invisible hammer had struck him in the chest. A spray of crimson mist erupted from his shoulder, painting a gruesome arc across the pristine snow. He gasped, a sound of pure shock, and slumped forward over the stallion's neck. "Ride!" he roared, the command tearing from his throat as he wheeled his horse around, putting his own body between Clara and the tree line. A second shot rang out, whining past Clara's ear like an angry hornet, chipping the stone face of the cliff behind her. The peace was gone, replaced by the chaotic, deafening reality of an ambush. The horses screamed, dancing sideways in panic. Elias slid from the saddle, his legs failing him, hitting the ground hard. He didn't stay down. Adrenaline, that ancient fuel of the dying, dragged him upright. He grabbed Clara's rein, yanking her roan behind a cluster of granite boulders just as a volley of gunfire erupted from the ridge above, turning the snow around them into geysers of ice and dirt. They collapsed into the cover of the rocks, the air filled with the smell of sulfur and the metallic tang of blood. Elias leaned back against the granite, his face grey and slick with sweat. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the sleeve of his coat already dark and heavy with blood. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his eyes losing focus. He fumbled for his revolver with his good hand, but his grip was weak. The hunters had the high ground. They were pinned, bleeding, and outgunned. "They're flanking," Elias gritted out, the pain etching deep lines around his mouth. "They want the angles." He looked at Clara. The terror was back in her eyes, wide and white, but he saw something else there too, a steel that hadn't been there a week ago. He grabbed the front of her coat with his bloody hand, pulling her close. "Listen to me," he wheezed. "Take the roan, the draw behind us. It's steep, but the horse can make it. Go, now. I'll hold them off." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He couldn't hold off a stiff breeze in his condition, let alone 6 armed men. He was offering himself as a sacrifice to buy her a 10-minute head start. Clara looked at the draw, a narrow, terrifying slide of shale leading down into the dark timber. It was an escape route. It was freedom. It was exactly what the old Clara, the victim, would have taken. She looked back at Elias. He was fading, his head lolling back against the rock, his revolver slipping in his grasp. If she left, he died. If she left, the silence won. A cold, hard clarity washed over her, freezing the fear in her veins. She didn't look at the escape route. She looked at the Winchester rifle scabbarded on Elias's saddle, which lay pinned beneath the panicked stallion nearby. She moved, not away from the danger, but toward it. She crawled through the snow, bullets snapping overhead, and yanked the rifle free. She dragged it back to the rocks, the weight of the wood and steel heavy in her hands. Elias blinked, his eyes widening as he saw her lever around into the chamber with a decisive clack-clack. "Clara, no!" he groaned. "Run!" She ignored him. She rested the barrel on the granite, pressing the stock against her shoulder as she had seen him do. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. For the first time in her life, she was holding the thunder. She looked at Elias, her voice steady, no longer a rusty whisper but a clear, ringing bell. "I'm not leaving you." The mountains had a way of lulling a man into a false sense of security, whispering that the only dangers were the cold and the cliffs, concealing the truth that the most dangerous predators walked on 2 legs. For Elias and Clara, the morning broke with a deceptive, crystal clarity. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind a world scrubbed clean and blindingly white under a pale winter sun. They were close now. Elias had relaxed his guard, his posture in the saddle less rigid, his eyes softening as he pointed toward a narrow cleft in the rock formations ahead. "Snake Creek," he told her, his voice carrying through the crisp air. "The valley is just beyond that ridge. It's narrow, but once you're through, it opens up. Nobody comes up here. It's safe." The word hung in the air, a fragile promise made of glass. Clara felt a strange warmth bloom in her chest, a feeling she hesitantly identified as hope. She watched a hawk circling the thermal currents above, allowing herself to imagine a life where she didn't have to listen for footsteps. The silence of the high country was profound, a vast cathedral of quiet. Then the cathedral shattered. It didn't sound like a gunshot at first. It sounded like a dry branch snapping under a heavy boot, a sharp, cracking pop that echoed strangely off the canyon walls. But the sound was immediately followed by a wet, sickening thud. Elias jerked violently in his saddle, as if an invisible hammer had struck him in the chest. A spray of crimson mist erupted from his shoulder, painting a gruesome arc across the pristine snow. He gasped, a sound of pure shock, and slumped forward over the stallion's neck. "Ride!" he roared, the command tearing from his throat as he wheeled his horse around, putting his own body between Clara and the tree line. A second shot rang out, whining past Clara's ear like an angry hornet, chipping the stone face of the cliff behind her. The peace was gone, replaced by the chaotic, deafening reality of an ambush. The horses screamed, dancing sideways in panic. Elias slid from the saddle, his legs failing him, hitting the ground hard. He didn't stay down. Adrenaline, that ancient fuel of the dying, dragged him upright. He grabbed Clara's rein, yanking her roan behind a cluster of granite boulders, just as a volley of gunfire erupted from the ridge above, turning the snow around them into geysers of ice and dirt. They collapsed into the cover of the rocks, the air filled with the smell of sulfur and the metallic tang of blood. Elias leaned back against the granite, his face grey and slick with sweat. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, the sleeve of his coat already dark and heavy with blood. He was breathing in shallow, ragged gasps, his eyes losing focus. He fumbled for his revolver with his good hand, but his grip was weak. The hunters had the high ground. They were pinned, bleeding, and outgunned. "They're flanking!" Elias gritted out, the pain etching deep lines around his mouth. "They want the angles!" He looked at Clara. The terror was back in her eyes, wide and white, but he saw something else there too, a steel that hadn't been there a week ago. He grabbed the front of her coat with his bloody hand, pulling her close. "Listen to me," he wheezed. "Take the roan, the draw behind us. It's steep, but the horse can make it. Go, now. I'll hold them off." It was a lie, and they both knew it. He couldn't hold off a stiff breeze in his condition, let alone 6 armed men. He was offering himself as a sacrifice to buy her a 10-minute head start. Clara looked at the draw, a narrow, terrifying slide of shale leading down into the dark timber. It was an escape route. It was freedom. It was exactly what the old Clara, the victim, would have taken. She looked back at Elias. He was fading, his head lolling back against the rock, his revolver slipping in his grasp. If she left, he died. If she left, the silence won. A cold, hard clarity washed over her, freezing the fear in her veins. She didn't look at the escape route. She looked at the Winchester rifle scabbarded on Elias's saddle, which lay pinned beneath the panicked stallion nearby. She moved, not away from the danger, but toward it. She crawled through the snow, bullets snapping overhead, and yanked the rifle free. She dragged it back to the rocks, the weight of the wood and steel heavy in her hands. Elias blinked, his eyes widening as he saw her lever around into the chamber with a decisive clack-clack. "Clara, no," he groaned. "Run." She ignored him. She rested the barrel on the granite, pressing the stock against her shoulder as she had seen him do. She wasn't running. She wasn't hiding. For the first time in her life, she was holding the thunder. She looked at Elias, her voice steady, no longer a rusty whisper but a clear, ringing bell. "I'm not leaving you." The echo of the rifle shot seemed to hang in the valley forever, bouncing off the granite walls until it finally dissolved into the wind. Clara stood frozen, the stock of the Winchester still pressed against her cheek, her eyes fixed on the dark shape in the snow that used to be her husband. He didn't move. The chest that had puffed up with so much rage was still. The monster was just meat now. A strange, hollow sensation opened up in her stomach, not triumph, not joy, but a sudden vertiginous release, as if a rope she had been pulling against for years had suddenly snapped. She lowered the rifle, her arms trembling so violently she nearly dropped it. The adrenaline that had turned her into iron was evaporating, leaving her weak and shaking in the aftermath. Then a sound cut through the fugue state, a wet, ragged cough. "Elias." Clara dropped the rifle into the snow and scrambled back to the rocks. The sight of him stopped her breath. Elias was pale, his skin the color of old parchment, his lips tinged with blue. The snow beneath him was no longer white. It was a widening pool of crimson that steamed in the freezing air. He looked at her, his eyes unfocused, swimming with shock. "You," he whispered, the word bubbling up with blood. "You stood." Clara didn't answer. There was no time for words. The useless wife, the woman whose only skills were cooking and mending, saw the problem not as a tragedy, but as a task. She fell to her knees beside him, her hands moving with a frantic, desperate precision. She didn't have bandages. She didn't have a doctor. She had layers of cheap cotton and wool. She reached under her dress and tore a strip from her petticoat, the sound of ripping fabric loud in the quiet air. "This is going to hurt," she said, her voice sounding strange to her own ears, authoritative, steady. She pressed the wad of cloth directly into the hole in his shoulder. Elias arched his back, a guttural groan tearing from his throat, his boots scrabbling for purchase on the ice. Clara didn't flinch. She leaned her entire body weight onto the wound, using the pressure to dam the river of his life that was trying to escape. "Stay with me," she commanded. "Look at me, Elias. Don't you close your eyes." He focused on her, grounding himself in the intensity of her gaze. For the first time, he wasn't the protector looking at the victim. He was the dying man looking at his lifeline. "I'm here," he grit out, his teeth clenched against the agony. "I'm here." They stayed like that for an eternity, a tableau of survival carved in ice, the woman pressing life back into the man, their breath mingling in white clouds between them. Slowly, the flow of blood began to staunch. Clara worked quickly, wrapping the wound tight, binding his arm to his chest to immobilize it. She was covered in his blood, her hands stained red up to the wrists, but she didn't care. She wiped the sweat from his forehead with her sleeve. "We can't stay here," she said, looking at the sky where the sun was beginning to dip behind the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the valley. "The cold will kill you if the bullet doesn't." She stood up and whistled for the stallion. The horse, skittish but loyal, trotted back, blowing air through its nostrils. Clara grabbed Elias under his good arm. "Up," she said. "You have to help me. I can't carry you." It took every ounce of strength they both possessed, a symphony of grunts, curses, and sheer will. But they got him into the saddle. He slumped forward, gripping the mane. Clara didn't mount the roan. She took the stallion's reins in her hand and began to walk, leading him through the deep snow, step by agonizing step, toward the sanctuary of the valley he had promised her. She left the body of Silas behind to the wolves and the winter. She didn't look back. The valley didn't look like the rest of the world. Tucked behind the razor edge of the granite peaks, it was a bowl of sheltered stillness, protected from the wind that scourged the high country. As Clara led the exhausted stallion through the final stand of timber, the cabin appeared. Not a shack, but a home. It was built of sturdy, hand-hewn logs, with a stone chimney that promised warmth and a wide porch that looked out over a frozen creek. To Clara, whose life had been a series of temporary, drafty rooms, it looked like a castle. She got Elias inside, his weight heavy on her shoulder, dragging him into the main room, where the embers of a fire he had banked days ago still glowed faintly in the hearth. She didn't stop to admire the furniture or the bearskin rug. She focused on the man. She got him onto the bed, piled quilts over his shivering frame, and stoked the fire until the room roared with heat. For 2 days, the world shrank down to the 4 walls of that cabin. Clara became the nurse, the guard, and the keeper of the flame. She watched the fever spike and break. She fed him broth made from dried venison. She moved through the cabin not as a guest but as a woman who had earned her place in it. On the 3rd evening, the storm outside had settled into a gentle snowfall. Elias was sitting up, propped against the pillows, his color returning. He watched Clara moving around the kitchen, his eyes following her with a quiet intensity. "Under the floorboard," he said, his voice rough but steady. "By the fireplace. There's a loose stone." Clara paused, wiping her hands on her apron. She knelt by the hearth and pried up the stone. Underneath was a metal strongbox. "Bring it here," he said. Clara placed the heavy box on the quilt covering his legs. Elias fumbled with a key from around his neck, his fingers still stiff, and clicked the lock open. He didn't pull out gold. He pulled out a folded, thick piece of paper with an official seal. He held it out to her. "What is this?" Clara asked, taking the paper. Her hands were rougher now than they had been a week ago, stained with work and care. "It's the deed," Elias said softly, "to this valley, the mine up the creek, the cabin, everything." He took a breath, wincing slightly as his shoulder protested. "I transferred half of it into your name before I came down to the saloon. The other half, I signed over to you on the back in case I didn't make it back up the mountain." He looked at her, his eyes clear and vulnerable. "I told you, Clara. I didn't buy you. I paid a ransom. You were a hostage in that life. You're a free woman in this one. This land is yours. You can sell it. You can leave. You can take the gold and go to the city where no one knows your name." Clara looked down at the document. It was a fortune. It was freedom. It was the price he had paid, returned to her 1,000 times over. She looked at the legal script, the lines that defined ownership. Then she looked at the man. She saw the grey in his beard, the scar on his brow, and the way he looked at her, not with possession, but with hope. She thought of the silence of the valley, the warmth of the fire, and the ghost of the girl she used to be, buried back in the snow with Silas. She realized that freedom wasn't about having a deed in her pocket. It was about choosing where to rest her head. Clara stood up. She walked over to the roaring fireplace. She held the paper up, letting the firelight shine through the heavy bond. "Clara?" Elias asked, confusion coloring his voice. "What are you doing?" "I don't want to be paid," Clara said, her voice firm. "And I don't want to leave." She tossed the deed into the fire. The paper curled, blackened, and burst into flame, the sparks rushing up the chimney like fireflies. Elias watched it burn, his mouth slightly open. He looked back at her, and a slow, disbelief-breaking smile spread across his face, a smile that reached his eyes. Clara sat down on the edge of the bed, reaching out to take his good hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. "I'm home, Elias," she whispered. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the tracks, the blood, and the past, leaving the valley pure, silent, and gold.